Thank you all for joining. My name is Chris Green. I'm the Executive Director of the Animal Legal Defense Fund. We've got a really wonderful program planned for you all, and I'd really like to start off by thanking Kim and our Legislative Affairs Program team for helping put together such a wonderful event, and thanks to ALDF's events team as well for doing all the back end work to make this a reality, and especially to all of our wonderful panelists. But with that, I will turn it over to Kim, who's going to give you sort of a framing of what to expect for the next 2 days.
Thanks, Chris. Good morning and good afternoon. I'm Kim Kelly, the Director of Legislative Affairs at the Animal Legal Defense Fund. Thanks so much for joining us for the 2024 Animal Law Symposium, State Confinement Laws and the Future of Farmed Animal Policy. We're thrilled you've chosen to spend the next couple of days with us discussing the evolution of these laws. Improving farmed animal welfare remains one of the most critical animal protection objectives of our time. Recent estimates indicate that 9 billion land animals are slaughtered each year in the United States alone, many of them enduring horrific cruelty before they're killed. But while much of their suffering is physical in nature, and sadly legal, exempted in most states as standard industry practices, in some ways the psychological harm suffered by these intelligent animals caused by prolonged extreme confinement is even worse. But thankfully, whether it's pigs in gestation crates, hens in battery cages, or calves in veal crates, the momentum to reduce the suffering is on our side. In 2002, Florida voters passed a first-of-its-kind ballot initiative mandating that pregnant pigs simply have enough room to turn around. From humane standards to environmental, food safety, and human health concerns, it may seem fairly commonsensical and the bare minimum of what we should provide for these animals. But the effort drew significant ire and opposition from the animal agricultural industry. Despite their protests and efforts to thwart future success, the Florida initiative was just the beginning. 22 years later, 15 states have used ballot initiatives, legislation, and the regulatory process, or a combination of these, to enact laws banning the strict confinement of farmed animals. Pushing for further reform, in 2018, sales of non-conforming products, whether produced in the state or imported, was prohibited when California voters overwhelmingly voted in favor of Proposition 12. The pork industry subsequently sued, resulting in the landmark case National Pork Producers Council v. Ross. Last May, the United States Supreme Court upheld the law in a 5-4 opinion, prompting some members of Congress to consider, not for the first time, advancing federal legislation to preempt some state animal protection laws, including anti-confinement laws like Prop 12. For the next 2 days, you'll hear from a remarkable cast of panelists and diverse group of stakeholders, many of whom were instrumental in enacting and defending these laws. You'll also hear from policy and legal experts coordinating to defend against efforts to repeal these victories, as well as advocacy leaders who will provide insights and projections on the future of farmed animal policy, including how you can lend support to effectively advocate for farmed animals. Thank you for being here, and many thanks to our terrific panelists. We're so glad you've joined us. And now, Chris, I'll turn it back to you to get us started.
Great. Thanks so much, Kim. And again, thanks again for helping prepare such a wonderful symposium. I just have a couple housekeeping items before we get started. All sessions do feature closed caption subtitles. So to enable that feature, please click the upward arrow near the CC button at the bottom of your screen and select Show Subtitles. Please, if you do have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A box that you'll also see at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to as many questions as we can, but yes, please use the Q&A and not the chat for that. Also, the symposium is being recorded, and the recording will be shared with you later via email. So if you would not like to be part of that, please jump up. We also have a poll. Please take a moment to answer the poll question that appears on your screen. That is basically just asking if you would like to receive CLE credits for this session. So I myself am clicking yes right now. There we go. Attorneys seeking credit will receive information via email after the symposium concludes. So with that, I would like to kick off the event. So as Kim mentioned, Florida passed the first ballot initiative banning gestation crates for pigs back in 2002. Since then, 14 additional states have passed laws prohibiting extreme confinement of farmed animals, and in some cases, the sale of products from animals raised in extreme confinement. The process in each state is varied, and advocates have deployed a wide range of strategies to get those laws across the finish line. Anti-confinement legislation is passed via regular legislative process, through regulatory means, and by ballot initiative. We have some great experienced panelists with us today to give us an in-depth look at the state laws, as well as the strategies and campaigns for getting them passed. So I'll introduce them now alphabetically. We're going to start off with Josh Block. He's the Chief Executive Officer of the Accountability Board. Next, we have Brian Hackett, the Director of Government and Community Relations at Associated Humane Societies, and Stephanie Harris, the Senior Legislative Affairs Manager here at the Animal Legal Defense Fund. So thank you to each of our panelists for taking time out of their busy lives to join us and help share some of their expertise with us. So we'll kind of start off chronologically. I'd like to start with you, Josh. Can you talk a little bit about the strategy around those early ballot measures and which states when you were at HSUS, which you chose to address first, and what actions did you all take before even starting one of these ballot measures?
Well, Chris, it's great to be on. Kim, thanks for having me. ALDF, thanks for putting together this conference. And Steph, Brian, it's an honor to be a part of this great crew with my friends that we fought together for so many years. You know, since 2002, really the farm animal efforts in the United States kept increasing in its intensity. And the question is, where do we focus? There's myriad issues related to the treatment of farm animals. And what we really honed in on is, where is there a lot of animal suffering, and where can we stop it by bringing in the most number of people from all sides of the political spectrum? And with 2002, we really started with gestation crates because it's easy to explain. Any ordinary person seeing a mother pig in a crate so narrow she's unable to turn around will be on our side. And so we started in Florida. There wasn't much opposition that we faced, and we had to do a test. We had to see, how did this work out? And Florida, of course, is a ballot measure state, and we won. And after Florida, we went to Arizona to ban gestation crates and veal crates, where calves are confined, where they can't even turn around as well. From there, went to California during Prop 2 in 2008 to ban the intensive confinement of mother pigs, baby veal calves, egg-laying hens. And from there, went to Massachusetts. Steph did such a tremendous job leading the campaign there. Then back to California for Prop 12. And all of it increasing the standards for these animals. And most importantly, what I have found, Chris, is that we have smartly chosen as a movement to pick issues where we have successfully brought together people who are Democrats, Independents, and Republicans. We're talking about banning gestation crates in Florida, thanks to Brian's tremendous leadership, bringing together Republicans. In Massachusetts, thanks to Steph's leadership, passed a ballot initiative. They got more votes than any initiative for animals in history, any animal. And that's because we brought people together. And this initiative process is so special because we go right to the voters. We skip the ag committees, which I think many folks know are often geared against us, went right to ordinary American citizens who, by and large, in overwhelming force, voted to ban these practices in every single state that we went after over the last 20 years.
Great. And Steph, you and I actually met on the Question 3 campaign back in 2015, right when I had moved to Boston to work at Harvard. And my understanding is that, you know, we had polling showing that 80% of Massachusetts voters supported banning the extreme confinement of farmed animals. And yet year after year, even in a very blue state like Massachusetts, for 7 or 8 years straight, you all were just not able to get that through. The Agriculture Committee, the Joint Ag Committee, kept blocking that. And so that's why we had to sort of circumvent them by the ballot process and go straight to the people. And as Josh just mentioned, it then passed with 77.7% of voter support, almost exactly what the polling was showing us. So can you talk a little bit about what you did such a wonderful job leading that campaign? Can you talk a little bit about what set that campaign apart and talk about sort of national and local coalitions and the volunteer base and how you dealt with some of the opposition?
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and thank you, Josh. The Massachusetts confinement measure was the third animal protection ballot measure that I was able to work on, and it was an incredible campaign. And as you briefly mentioned, Chris, a lot of that had to do with the coalition that we had, as well as the volunteer base. And it had to do with the 10-year history that we had in the state, where advocates had been working on this issue in the legislature, trying to get it through. As you mentioned, we couldn't. It kept getting stuck along the way, which is what makes the ballot initiative process so incredible, is that when you have a legislature that isn't acting, taking action on an issue that the people really care about, this is an alternative way to pass a law. this law in particular was the first of its kind. It was the strongest law in the world for farm animals at the time of the campaign. And so that brought just an incredible amount of motivation to it. There was this history in Massachusetts of working on this issue for local advocates. But then there was also this history, like growing history, thanks to Josh and his team and so many others, working on similar issues in other states, and this one was broader. It was able to do even more, and so that was incredibly motivating to all of the animal advocates and animal protection organizations. And so that was a significant base of our coalition. We had over 100 animal organizations at the state and national level. We had over 100 farmers, over 300 veterinarians. There were environmental groups, food safety groups, farm workers. You know, the list just goes on and on.
Religious leaders.
Yeah, absolutely. Religious leaders. Yeah. And elected officials at the local and state level. And it was an incredible coalition and a true collaboration. There were a lot of organizations that worked really closely as sort of a core coalition to help advance this campaign, sharing office space and staff time and funding and so many resources. And so, you know, this campaign couldn't have unfolded the way that it did without the support of the Humane Society of the United States, the MSPCA, the Animal Rescue League of Boston, Zoo New England, so many other groups in Mass and beyond, and also the volunteer base. We had over 1,000 volunteers that helped collect signatures on this campaign, and we benefited from the fact that there was some existing familiarity with the initiative process among animal folks specifically. So in '96, there was a wildlife protection initiative. In the 2000s, there was a greyhound initiative. And then more recently, there was an environmental initiative. And so there was some familiarity with folks that we absolutely benefited from. And then dealing with the opposition, you know, there was local opposition, national opposition. We were lucky that they didn't end up spending a ton of money in Massachusetts, but we were sort of always braced for that possibility because, of course, they could have dumped millions and millions of dollars into that campaign. So we were always ready if that happened. And we made ours as grassroots a campaign as we could. We qualified for the signature, we qualified for the ballot through 2 signature drives, and we were the only campaign in Mass that year, that election cycle, that was able to do it without hiring a paid signature gathering firm. A lot of campaigns require basically hiring a firm that then pays people per signature to get this across the finish line, because as folks may know, the initiative petition process is getting more difficult as time goes on, and that's in part a reflection of the incredible successes that have taken place through that process.
And one thing to keep in mind is that, you know, this isn't an option that's available in every state. I think it's only 24 states that do allow to use the ballot measure process. But it was extremely effective. And again, I think also very strategic in starting with Massachusetts, where there wasn't a great deal of domestic production employing some of these methods, but adding the sales ban so that any producers in Iowa, so egg producers or pork producers that wanted to then sell products into Massachusetts, had to meet these same requirements, which is then what was then replicated in a state like California, which is like the 4th largest economy in the world. So it had a much bigger impact. So Brian, you know, Stephanie mentioned that Zoo New England was one of the primary partners on the question 3. And I think that might surprise some people to hear that a zoo is involved in sort of banning the confinement and captivity of animals. Can you talk a little bit about your experience in New Jersey with the legislation there, and how working with unexpected allies or stakeholders who previously could be considered maybe as being opposed to some of these types of measures, and how working with them to help get laws passed to better protect farmed animals and reduce their suffering? Like, how did you approach that?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Great question. And unfortunately, in New Jersey, we're one of the states that does not have citizen-led initiative process. So we have to go through the legislative process directly with lobbying legislators to get the law passed. And I mean, I think, I always like to say politics is the art of the possible. And I think whenever it comes to any of these efforts, it's just smart politics to try to build as broad of a coalition as possible and get as much support from any reputable individual or organization that you can get. But sometimes it gets to a point when you need to deal with folks that would not necessarily be normal or expected allies or parts of an animal rights centric coalition. I know Josh has a lot of experience dealing with the egg producers with different initiatives and laws he's worked on, and he's done fabulous work there. So, working with egg producers in states to get cage-free initiatives passed is an example. In New Jersey, what ultimately we ended up having to do, and ALDF was a major part of this and helped drive it, was we ended up deciding to meet with the New Jersey Farm Bureau. And farm bureaus are not typically organizations that are amenable to being supportive of any of these initiatives, let alone being progressive leaning in terms of farm animal treatment, right? And the New Jersey Farm Bureau was traditionally a group opposed to the gestation crate bill in New Jersey, and probably many of the people on the webinar know that this was a 13-year-long process going all the way back to 2010, and made Jon Stewart and late night shows, and it was just kind of ridiculous how something that could pass the legislature with overwhelming support and 91% support when it was polled in the public. The governor at the time, Governor Christie, vetoed it, not once, but twice. And so moving forward from that process, we finally got the law passed in 2023. So, it got to a juncture where we sat down and we said, what we've been doing, as great as it's been in steering publicity and showing support for this, it's just not cutting it. And sometimes you have to assess the battlefield and look at unlikely allies and see where you may be able to find some common ground. And I decided to sit down with the Farm Bureau, and we found a reasonable, reputable individual there who wanted to be a partner in finally getting this done, because frankly, from their perspective, they were sick and tired of dealing with it. And it was just something that was continually dogging them. And so since we don't have the initiative process in New Jersey that's citizen-led, we were working with a piece of legislation where we sat down and we said, where can we have some common ground here? And what can we do to work out a compromise where we can show legislators that there is consensus on this and it's politically feasible and politically prudent to move forward with it. And that was where I have to compliment the New Jersey Farm Bureau in this. We really sat down and we looked at the legislation, and the victory for us was that we codified in the legislation, in the statute, that cruel intensive confinement for gestating sows and veal calves would be prohibited in the state of New Jersey. And where we compromised was in the regulatory process, how that got implemented and enforced. And so, one thing the gentleman from the Farm Bureau said to me, I'll never forget, was, look, I want our farmers to treat animals properly and follow the law, if not the only reason, because when they don't, it creates numerous problems for us in terms of publicity and business and everything else. So we were able to come together, and we came together on great language, and we went to the bill sponsors, we went to the committee chairs, and we said, look, we have animal protection groups, we have the New Jersey Farm Bureau, we've come to a consensus on this, there's broad support. We essentially eliminated the opposition. The national pork producers used to intervene, and they did not. which was fabulous. And we finally got it done. So, looking at the big broader picture, some states you could do this through initiative and referendum. Some states have done it through just the regulatory process. The administrative agency has done it, which is great. Other states, you have to go through the legislative process, the normal old, lawmaking. And we did that with engaging with unlikely allies in that particular situation. And granted, you have to recognize, I wasn't looking to get this guy to be a vegan as much as I would have loved him to be a vegan. But, we acknowledge where we were never going to agree, and we acknowledge where we could have common ground and work together. And it was a mutually beneficial result that, of course, has helped move, this issue forward and has guaranteed that animals will not be subjected to that cruel confinement, and no new companies are going to come to the Garden State and set up with intensive confinement for calves or pigs. So it was a fabulous victory. And, again, kudos to everybody that was involved, from ALDF to HSUS to state, local, national groups. It was a team effort, and it was a great victory.
That's really wonderful. On the ballot side, I mean, ASPCA has some really good consistent polling that shows that 94% of Americans feel that animals raised for food should not suffer any abuse or cruelty. So you would think, like, it's kind of hard to come up with a single other issue in contemporary American politics where you have 94% consensus on something. So you think, like, well, this should be easy, right? This is how everyone feels. Like, legislators should just go ahead. I mean, it's their job to hammer the social consensus into law. But as Brian just explained, there's certain roadblocks we run into with that. But then people think, well, okay, well, we can just go around the legislature and do a ballot initiative, right? So, but it's obviously not that easy. So, Josh, can you talk a little bit about what people or organizations should consider before thinking about launching a ballot measure somewhere?
You're right, Chris. One would think the 94% is like, oh, piece of cake. Well, this is one of the most intensive ways to ever get a victory for farm animals. And I would say the victory side is tremendous. The loss side could be devastating as well. So it is a big risk. And so the first thing that, at least I think what we look at collectively as we move forward on this, is it part of a national effort to move industries in a certain direction? Because doing a one-off initiative on an issue that won't then continue on beyond a victory, it doesn't seem to me the best use of time. It doesn't seem to me to have the type of impact I think we're all trying to achieve for animals. So as an example, when we talk about bans on gestation crates or veal crates or battery cages for hens, we want to get rid of those practices nationally, and I think we have a chance to do it. So it makes sense to really tackle that at the state level and then go from there. Secondly, what we really need to do is do polling to make sure that we're going to win. Like, I'm not in this just to put up a good fight. I want to win. Brian didn't work as hard as he did just to, like, hey, we really tried hard. No, he wants to win. Steph did not fight major opposition in Massachusetts just for the sake of being on the side of the moral good. No, we want to win for animals. It's too often in our movement that we're on the right side, but we're not on the winning side. Those days are done. We have to be on the winning side, and that's why polling matters. We do all have emotions to stop cruelty to animals, and that's a good thing that empowers us. At the same time, we have to look at data to make sure that when we go forward and devote a year of our lives to something and many millions of dollars to something and put such a risk forward, that we're actually going to win. So in-depth polling, not polling that's a push poll, like, oh, great, we're going to get 99% of the vote because we put the poll the way we want. No, I'm talking about giving the best opposition arguments against us in the same poll. Does that sway people? If the polling shows that we're going to win and win significantly, that's a good data point that one should go forward for sure. What I would say there, once we get that polling in, we know the issues we want to focus on. We got to make sure we write the legislation, the ballot measure, in a way that's constitutional. As we talked about, obviously, these laws get challenged. Steph is still dealing with that in Massachusetts to this day. Obviously, Prop 12 case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. If it's not constitutional, then we go backwards. So we really have to make sure that it's not a cavalier way of just, hey, we'll just ban gestation crate, ban the sale of eggs from caged chickens. And no, in a real in-depth legal review to make sure that the best opposition arguments can't win the day in the courts. That would be a real disaster. We also need to make sure that we have major fundraising to win the effort. In California's Prop 12, a big part of my entire life for a year was raising money. And so we, as a movement, put more money into Prop 12 than I believe any campaign in US history. It was about $13 million. And we needed it because we had major animal agribusiness opposition. And they were very much against what we were doing in California. As Steph mentioned, we were all gearing up about the big opposition coming to Massachusetts, and they did put in some money. And let me tell you the arguments they put out there. They put out there things like, there's not going to be any more affordable food. The shelves will be empty. And I'm sure Steph remembers this TV commercial against us, where they showed shelves in grocery stores empty because animals are now able to turn around, including like shelves where potato chips were. Like, I have no idea why that made any sense. But they're trying to make these apocalyptic images to try to scare people. And if we don't have the money to counter it, then what we're left to is trying to do media appearances and other things to earn media. But that's just not going to win the day. We actually need advertising. I don't just trust us on a screen. Just look in politics. Virtually all the dollars that are raised by people running for Congress, Senate, and president, that goes to advertising. And the animal side needs the same thing. So if we're gearing up to do a ballot measure, and at the end we think, gosh, this is going to be pretty expensive, and we're not going to be able to bring in the funds, in my mind, that's a real reason not to go forward. We have to be able to beat opposition because they're going to fight as hard as they can. Once all those things are checked off, I think then that puts us in a very positive position to move forward.
Great. And this question, I'll bet back to you and bring Steph in. So you talked a little bit about this, some of the various components of waging the campaign. So actually, I'll just jump to Steph because you'd covered some of those. Like, do you have anything to add on to those various components of how you wage one of these ballot initiative campaigns to add to what Josh said?
Well, I think Josh did a great job giving an overview on the factors to consider. And I could take hours of everyone's time to talk about the specifics of waging one of these campaigns, and I would love to, but that's not the goal of this particular talk. So I'll stay a little bit narrower. And one of the things I wanted to add on as another factor for serious consideration is the potential for backlash for these ballot measures. It is, someone had asked a question in the Q&A chat about whether these can be overturned and repealed by the legislature. And there are many states in which the very next day after a measure passes at the ballot on election day, it can be repealed by the legislature the very next day. There are some states that have more of a grace period, a window of time where they can't overturn it. But that's a factor for consideration is really knowing the nitty gritty of your state specific process. And then, so that's one potential for backlash is that you could actually win and then lose essentially. But also, have you tried to move this through the legislature first? Because if you are interested, or you have coalition partners in the state that are interested in continuing to pass additional animal protections in that state, the legislature can't be wholly your enemy, right? Like it is very advantageous to try to work with them for a significant amount of time before taking something to the ballot. So in Massachusetts, there was about a 10-year history of trying to get something through. And that's not only, to be cooperative with the legislature if you want to keep working with them. It's also a very strategic decision in terms of resources, because a ballot measure, as Josh mentioned, is incredibly expensive, and you could spend many, many years of putting funding into lobbying and not come close to the amount of resources you would need for a bare bones ballot measure. So if you can move things through the legislature, that is something to seriously consider. And even if you can't immediately, like, what does the trajectory look like? What's the political landscape in your state? And might you be able to in 1 or 2 years? And so if you could, is it worth putting in those resources on a ballot measure? And then also, it can be a great tool for building a solid and broad and deep coalition, but it can also do that for your opposition. They can become very organized and entrenched in a way that they may not have been. And that can have serious repercussions on other issues that you might work on down the road. So those are just a few things that I would keep in mind as well.
Great. Brian, one question that's come in is, it's great that the law in New Jersey was passed, but who makes sure that it's actually being enforced, and how do you go about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so the law in New Jersey, as I referenced, so the compromise was the animal cruelty component and the standard of no intensive confinement for these animals was in the statute. But in working with the Farm Bureau on, where's their position, what's common ground, what can we do? It was amazing to learn that their opposition, and perhaps their position had evolved over the 13 years, but their position at that time, in the final rendition of the work on the law, was that they weren't in principle opposed to allowing animals the space to freely move and turn around. What they told me was that their issue was how and where the regulations governing the humane standards for farm animals are housed in New Jersey regulatory code. So that was like, wow. So, we have Title IV, which is the criminal animal cruelty statute, and we have Title VIII is the agricultural standards in the state codes. So what some earlier versions of the legislation did was it put some of these things in the Title IV area where the Farm Bureau wanted things housed under the regulatory area in Title VIII. So when it comes to the enforcement of this, it allowed for 6 months for promulgation of language. And of course, it falls under the Department of Agriculture. So in terms of enforcement, people can file animal complaint forms with the department, and those are required to be looked at by their chief enforcement officer. And those are in another law we got passed. It requires humane law enforcement to submit information to the Department of Ag and involve them. And interestingly, amazing how everything comes full circle sometimes, and working with unlikely allies and people who may have been opposition at one point, but they're not anymore. The individual that I worked with on this legislation is now the Secretary of Agriculture for the state of New Jersey. And so that's amazing.
Wow.
And so here we have someone who was with an entity that was once opposition. We fostered great connections with the animal rights, animal welfare world, and we passed a landmark bill after 13 years of different renditions of it. And now this gentleman is the Secretary of Agriculture. So I don't have any concerns about proper enforcement for this legislation, at least in the context in New Jersey. Of course, the normal process that we should all be aware of is it takes a long time to get a law passed, and it takes even more time to get it properly implemented, enforced, public awareness of that law being passed and in place. So it's an ongoing process that we're always working to educate prosecutors about, and ALDF does a great job with their prosecutor guides that are published. So those are fabulous resources for prosecutors about state-by-state laws on these areas for farm animals. So it's an ongoing process, but advocates and others have their eyes and ears out and to the ground and are paying attention. And, when the law was, the great thing about passing these laws or doing these initiatives or doing these things is the educational component that you get out of it, right? When there's so much press on the issue and the process, and then it finally gets signed into law or it finally passes, there's so much press and attention to it. It has the ripple effect of so many people saying, oh my God, I didn't even know that pigs were kept in this way. And it's just such a great educational component too, when you have these victories and you do this work in raising awareness about the plight of animals and that there are cruelty laws that need to be enforced.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's one great byproduct of the signature gathering phase of these ballot initiatives. If you've got these, whole teams of volunteers out there meeting outside Whole Foods and directly engaging with people and kind of talking to them one-on-one about the horrors of factory farming, and the value of that goes far beyond just, getting their vote on for the ballot on election day. And it's a great point you made about the enforcement. So when Josh and I were standing in line outside the Supreme Court to hear the Prop 12 hearings, one of the guys next to me actually was an attorney who had drafted an amicus brief on the other side, representing a bunch of Minnesota pork producers. And in talking to him and just trying to share perspectives, surprisingly, he said that most of the folks he was representing, they didn't really have that much of a problem with the core idea of Prop 12. That was simply a market decision that, if you felt that you could build these larger enclosures and that would still be profitable for you to then have access to the California market, you could do so. If you didn't have to do so. You could choose not to sell in California. The main thing that they had a problem, which surprised me, the main thing that they had a problem with was the idea of having sort of California officials tramping around their farms and their facilities up in Minnesota trying to figure out enforcement. And that just seemed to me kind of an easy fix. So I was a bit surprised by that. So shifting gears a little bit, and this question is both for Steph and Josh. Historically, a lot of the early animal protection ballot measures were about issues focusing on things other than farmed animal confinement, such as wildlife issues. And to Josh's point about the losses really being hard, in Maine, there was a loss over a bear baiting ballot initiative, as I recall, and that was really painful for a lot of advocates who had worked on that. Steph, can you talk a little bit about how the ballot, and you too, Josh, about how the ballot measure process and the movement's use of it is changing over time, based on what you've already learned from things that have gone on, and again, talk about some of the specifics, how the variance in signature gathering and stray marks. I mean, as you alluded to, in Massachusetts, we gathered double. Not only did we manage to get all those signatures without having to pay for any of them, we actually gathered double the number of signatures that were required to make sure that we just had enough of a cushion. So after all that work, it wouldn't get tossed.
Yeah. So as everybody's heard, there's about half of the states that have the initiative process, but what the actual number looks like from a practical standpoint isn't always that 24, just because of how high the hurdle is in some states to actually getting a measure on the ballot. But to answer the question about the history, so the initiative petition process in the states has its roots in the populist and progressive movements back in the 19th and early 20th century. And so that's when there were issues that were taken on through the process, like women's suffrage and secret ballots and the direct election of senators. And it was the populist skepticism of representative democracy that allowed those initial states that established this process. They created more like binding, more long-lasting measures, so they couldn't necessarily be overturned so quickly, and generally had easier qualifying requirements than some of the subsequent states. So that was out west to start. That's when Oregon, California, Washington, some of the states that you really associate with this process. And then it was in the 60s through the 90s that more states started to join and have that initiative process. And those later states tend to have more constraints than those with the populist era origin story, if you will. And so that's one factor. And then another is there has been a shift in access and use of the process that has evolved as a result of the successes of those more progressive initiatives. And so in particular, we've seen efforts to restrict access to the process. Some of the early, as you mentioned, Chris, initiatives in the states had to do with a lot to do with hunting and trapping, especially in the 1920s and after, when you started to see like a lot of concerns over conservation of certain wild animal species. And it was in the 90s that there was a California I think it was a California regulation that was passed about hunting big cats, and there was a huge outcry. And so there was an effort then to ban trophy hunting through the ballot. And that was like one of the sort of tipping point measures. And then since then, the animal protection movement has come together to use this as a backstop when progress through the legislatures fails. And HSUS has historically led these efforts together with partners at the national level and at the state level, wherever they were working on them. And I want to say it's like something like 60 measures, animal protection measures, since the 90s. And they have over 70%, I think, success rate. And the success of these measures is unfortunately only becoming more burdensome as politics generally becomes more expensive, right? Because when you're competing for an ad buy, right, you're trying to get your commercials on TV, trying to get your op-eds placed, trying to just get attention from folks. It's only getting harder as there's more money being dumped into other issues, right? It makes it more expensive. And then you mentioned stray marks. So different states, as you've heard me say, have different requirements. In Massachusetts, for example, if you are collecting signatures on your petition sheet, which is a legal document, you can't just print one out at home. It's like it has to be formatted exactly the way the state has approved, et cetera, et cetera. But if you're out gathering signatures and say there's 40 slots for spaces, right? And the signatures have to be gathered town specifically. So anyone on one anyone on one petition sheet have to all be from the same municipality, because those signatures have to be approved at the municipal level and then later at the state level. And so if you're on your, say, 40th signature from Newton and somebody's pen isn't working and they just scribble in the corner, making a stray mark, that can potentially invalidate the entire petition sheet and all of those signatures. So that's one of the reasons why it was so important, as you mentioned, that we gather far and above the actual bare minimum requirement for qualifying. And states are exploring adding more burdensome requirements for the signature process. More distribution requirements, making sure that there are more than a certain percentage of signatures gathered from different counties, et cetera, requiring gatherers to be to register with the state, to wear certain badges, to never leave the petitions unattended. They're just really onersome requirements and only trending in that direction. And so that's why one of the things, as much as I love the ballot initiative process, right? Like I caught the ballot bug when I started working in these years ago, but it's such an important consideration for using this tool is, are you really going to get what you need out of it in terms of starting a conversation or testing the waters versus are you going to get the policy impact that you want and what will build from there? That's my puppy. She would like to let the crows know that they should not be here. But I'll turn it over to Josh, see if he has more to add on that.
I appreciate Lola's input there. So Josh, actually, I want to switch a little bit. So many people typically think, well, one thing to follow up on what Steph is saying is also, these state level ballot initiatives are very expensive, cost millions of dollars. And we've seen a trend now with folks looking to do ballot measures on a smaller scale. So in like Denver or Sonoma County or for different issues. But I think it's good for people to understand that the ballot measure process is not just an offensive tool for the animal protection movement, but we often have to play defense towards ballot measures that might try to further harm animals. Some examples of that are what are known as, they call right to farm initiatives, which we call right to harm, the right to harm animals, harm local communities. And I remember, I think it was in 2015 in Missouri, there was one of these right to harm ballot measures, and everyone just thought, it's Missouri, they're really organized. We're not going to really spend a lot of resources opposing this. And when you were at the Humane Society of the United States, I think just like with a month out, you're like, well, we got to at least try, right? And so you guys launched this campaign, and within 3 weeks generated so much opposition that you came within a quarter point of defeating that measure and to triggering a recount. And I think everyone was pretty amazed, which then again underscores how generally the American public does really feel strongly about these issues. And it's, it is that frustration, like that 94% figure we mentioned. And you think that would be an easy win to get that into the law, but the reality is the exact opposite. Farmed animals are categorically excluded from the Federal Animal Welfare Act. I think 37 US states have some form of exemption for farmed animals related to their cruelty codes, either outright exempting them or exempting what are called usual and customary practices. But I know in Oklahoma, they then were successful in defeating one of these right to harm ballot measures. A group called the Kirkpatrick Foundation sort of led that charge, and they employed everyone from like Wayne Coyne from the Flaming Lips to the famous Oklahoma Sooners coach Barry Switzer, and were able to win. Can you talk a little bit about some of the defensive side of this and maybe some of the local measures?
Yeah, you're right, Chris, is that opposition tried to push things forward. And what's interesting too is when opposition pushes things forward, they know that ordinary voters are pro-animal, so they never push things in a way that's worded that seems anti-animal, because they know that won't fly, even in places like Missouri or Oklahoma. So when they had the right to farm, as Chris notes, it's more of a right to harm, they never argue like, hey, we want to treat animals any way that we want, including putting them in cages. No, of course, they put imagery out there of these beautiful small family farms where animals are running around outside, have an idyllic life. Of course, the reason why they really wanted to do right to farm is because they didn't want to have to deal with local communities cracking down on factory farms. They didn't want to deal with ordinary people in their state trying to pass laws to crack down on the practices that are going on within the factory farms. And so even when they are playing offense, so to speak, they don't play as if they're anti-animal. So we have to make sure that the voters know, wait a second, just so you know, the yes side on this initiative, that actually is the anti-animal side. And that's how we win over people, even in what could be perceived as tougher states, like in Oklahoma. And Chris is right that, there are local initiatives going on because cities also have ballot measure processes. So there's, there are local initiatives in Denver as an example to ban slaughterhouses within the city. And there is a slaughterhouse that kills baby lambs within Denver, and also initiative in the same city to ban the sale of fur. Of course, we understand the suffering that goes to fur-bearing animals, especially in fur factory farms, and how they are trapped and killed in wildlife. And that is a unique way to start going after these very harmful realities for animals, is by having more localized efforts that don't take as many resources, don't have to reach such large populations, but can still have an impact on animals. I would still argue that we would still want it to be part of some type of national effort overall, like the sale of fur. I don't think any of us tuning in here want fur to remain being sold in the United States or elsewhere. And I think tackling on a local level is a very strong thing to do. And to Chris's point about how ballot measures have evolved, so is what to do after ballot measures have evolved. After we won Prop 12, we got 63%. I know I failed to get to Steph's mark at 78%. She's obviously more effective than I was, but
Still a California record.
We still did well. Thank you, buddy. We still did well. Because we did that in 2018, we didn't just win. We won by a lot, and we really crushed our opposition. And now that creates a mentality. The mentality is they don't want to face us again. So what did we do? We went to Oregon, Washington, and Michigan saying, listen, we have an interest to come in here to do something similar, but we're also looking to find some common ground, similar to what Brian talked about earlier in New Jersey. And because we won by not by 1%, But what we won by an overwhelming vote, the Oregon agribusiness interest said, yes, we would rather find common ground than have to face y'all. And so right after Prop 12 was 2018, 2019, we passed laws banning the production and the sale of eggs from caged chickens in Oregon, Washington, and Michigan, all in the same year. Right after that in Colorado, it's like, listen, Colorado could be a ballot measure here. The agribusiness is like, oh, please don't. Hey, let's find common ground. In the middle of the heat of COVID in 2020, when the legislature was shut down, other than a few weeks, we still passed a law to ban the production and sale of eggs from caged chickens. Then we did something similar in Nevada, in Arizona. And then, working side by side, of course, with Steph being a leader in Massachusetts, upgraded the ballot initiative that Steph led to even higher level from there. So how we have evolved in the ballot measure process is that we have been able to move away from the ballot measure process in many states. And that's simply because not only do we win, but we have to win in a landslide.
That's a really great point, especially that as we kind of talked about ourselves, the animal protection side having to play defense. When you do these ballot measures, industry has to play defense and they have to spend a bunch of money on it themselves. And so it's great to have this sort of carrot and stick options for that. And this is a perfect segue to shifting gears from talking about the ballot measure process to exactly what you were talking about, passing anti-confinement legislation through the regular legislative process. And so, Brian, some of these efforts, such as the New Jersey gestation crate bill, or bills plural, they were a decades plus long effort. In fact, my first meeting with a member as ALDF's new legislative director back in 2013 was with Senator Lesniak, and that's where I first met Kathy Schatzman and many others. And we were strategizing, met him at a golf course, strategizing on an earlier version of the bill. And then I later testified at the fall 2014 committee hearing, which moved another version of this bill to the floor. It was actually pretty funny. I testified with Matthew Dominguez, who was at HSUS at the time. And it was he and myself up against someone from on the other side with someone from the National Pork Producers Council and the American Farm Bureau, I think. And I have managed a farm that's been in my family for 186 years. Matt Dominguez grew up on a ranch in California, and the two representatives of industry look like these total city slickers who would never come within 50 miles of a farm. And it was really fun to be able to flip that around. But, unfortunately, as you pointed out earlier, Governor Christie vetoed some of those early bills. So why do you think it takes so long to get such laws passed in some states, even when there's popular support?
Right. Well, I will say, just to start, the silver lining, as frustrating as it was that it took so long to get the law passed, the silver lining was, one, the original legislation included only pigs, and it was expanded to include veal calves. So that was one silver lining. And of course, the second silver lining were the connections made with unlikely friends and allies on this issue, and the connections we have with them now that I referenced. So a common frustration we all have as animal advocates is nothing ever seems to get done as quickly as it should. And that's a really tough thing to deal with for any of us in this, from the most seasoned to the newest advocates. Things just seem to take much longer than they should, especially with the legislative process. And, a couple things to keep in mind with the process is, first, even our biggest friends and champions in the legislature, our bill sponsors, the people who stand with us at in the protests and they sponsor our bills, those folks have other priorities and other, issues to address. State legislators are dealing with lots of different things, if they're full-time or part-time, if they have office staff or if they don't have office staff. So really being mindful of our friends and our legislative allies and what their situation is. And a question that I always ask our bill sponsors is, well, first, after thanking them, I say, what can we do to help you move this bill forward? If they have staff, developing those good conversations and good connections with their staff, because sometimes those are key gatekeepers with even our biggest friends in the legislature. But in addition to being mindful about our bill sponsors and our legislative allies, it's what kind of legislature and what type of calendar are you dealing with in your state? There is wide variability around the country with this. I mean, some states have very short legislative sessions, sometimes 1 month, 3 months, 6 months. In other states like New Jersey, we have a 2-year-long legislative session that really doesn't go out of session. There are some breaks throughout the year for summer recess and holidays and such, but it's a 2-year-long session. So really being mindful of what type of playing field are you on with your legislative session in terms of timing, because those things really matter. The length of time, sometimes you have to rush things, get a bill introduced and have your bill sponsor get a committee hearing, and it all has to happen in 3 months. Whereas other states where it's really prolonged, like in New Jersey, it's often lots of periods of stop and go and stop and go. And it's a roller coaster because you're working around, well, the first 4 months of the year, they're largely figuring out budget. And then you have a smaller window, and then you try to get things in before summer recess. And then you try to get things in before the November elections coming around when they're distracted with the election activities. So those are 2 things to be really, really mindful of in terms of just why sometimes things take more time than we think that they should. But I think, being mindful and being strategic with these issues, and being willing to to improvise and be flexible, change up strategy. And as I said, the bill in New Jersey was just taking so long, and just the usual things were not, moving the needle. And okay, so let's reassess and let's, re-strategize and regroup and keep this going. So, those are particular issues that I think, take why things take longer, but also finally, just issues that are totally external and totally non-relative to our issues sometimes, affect something. There's a natural disaster in a state, or there's some other big explosive issue that goes on that has nothing to do with animals, and that derails attention, and it derails progress that you were making on your animal issues. So there's a number of reasons why things could take longer, but many are often not within our control. But what is within our control is how we respond to them, and being creative and strategic. And when you have good partners, working, leading your coalition, and you have experts like folks at ALDF and other nationals, and, everybody's putting their resources together. I mean, we had a fabulous coalition in New Jersey, and a common thread of all this with Josh and Steph is it takes a village, it takes a coalition. And I know Chris, you were involved in the coalition calls with the New Jersey Ban the Crates Coalition, and we were just always just sticking to it and improvising and addressing and reassessing. So I would just encourage everybody to stay motivated, stay vigilant, and just stay strong on the mission, because clearly from this webinar, we've seen the overwhelming amount of successes that have been had in blue states, red states, north, south, east, west, all over the place, whether through regulation, legislation, ballot initiative. So I think the wind is at our backs, and the momentum is with us because of all the progress. We just have to keep going.
Absolutely. And I really think it's important too to really support your allies any way that you can. So as I mentioned, New Jersey Senator Lesniak was one of the early proponents. And, this process was so long, he had to run for governor in there. And then even after he retired from the legislature, he was still one of the strongest voices on these later measures and helped get it across the finish line. And so it wasn't just something he was interested while he was, in the New Jersey legislature. This really did sink into his core, and it became part of, one of his sort of life's goals. Steph, so question 3 in Massachusetts subsequently later was updated by the legislature. Can you talk a little bit about why and how that happened, and what could be next for farmed animals in states that already have passed some confinement bans?
Sure. So yeah, Josh had, I think, mentioned this earlier, that Prop 12 in 2018, it codified a shift in cage-free standards that had been popularized after the drafting of the Massachusetts Question 3 law. And so after Question 3 passed, and then California subsequently, 2 years later, passed their law, Massachusetts we worked to try to bring our law in Mass in line with what passed in California and subsequently in Colorado and all these other states that you've heard mentioned. And so that was a multi-year process. And it also highlights how important it is to have strong relationships and to be invested in the long term, right? We didn't win Question 3 and then walk away, right? I was in Massachusetts for years. I only very recently moved to Vermont, I swear. So, I was really embedded in the state and working with those same volunteers and those same coalition partners for years afterward. And it became so important in trying to get this through the legislature. We were not able to pass the confinement ban through the legislature for so long. And similarly, there was a lot of hesitation in amending what passed at the ballot. So passing something at the ballot can work in your favor or sort of against you if you need to tinker with it, right? Because in some cases, the legislature will come in the next day and they will change it or they will repeal it. But sometimes they will rely on the fact that this was passed by the voters and therefore we shouldn't touch it. And so we were dealing with some of that. As well as needing to clearly demonstrate that this was in the interest of animals. So it was something that producers were interested in. It was something that animal organizations were interested in. And so it is another reason why, jumping back to what Brian was talking about the need to work with unlikely allies, I was working hand in hand with the opponents from our Question 3 campaign to try to pass this upgrade. So I worked very closely along with Josh and along with our coalition partners in Massachusetts with the trade group, the national trade group for the ag industry and the local trade group for the ag industry to try to pass this. It took the proponents and the opponents of Question 3 as it related to hens coming together to get this upgrade passed. It was finally passed by the legislature and signed into law in late 2021. And basically it mandated access to certain enrichments that improve the conditions in which hens are kept. So it also included a little bit of a shift in the minimum square footage so that could reflect a shift in interest in not just floor-based barns, but also in aviaries where birds get use of vertical space. And so this made that adjustment, recognizing that these aviaries provide different types of conditions for hens, but then also we needed these enrichments in place because there's science out there that clearly shows that welfare, the well-being of animals is improved, not just by a certain amount of space, but by an enriched environment. So this required nest boxes, dust bathing and scratching areas, as well as perches. So things that really allowed the animals to exhibit, these egg-laying hens to exhibit their natural behaviors. We also were able to expand the application so that it applied to not just whole shell eggs like you would see in a carton, but also liquid eggs. So that's what you see commonly used in, fast food or commercial kitchens, cafeterias, things like that. And so we worked so closely with the former opponents to make that happen. And what we see looking forward is opportunities to protect farm animals through other means as well. So we've done a lot to tackle this issue of confinement, but even when you're looking at animals that have more space, there can be other aspects of their conditions that are cause for concern. So as an example, one of the bills that we're working on in Massachusetts right now is one that would allow for the authorization or for the issuance of civil citations for keeping certain animals, which includes farm animals, in cruel conditions. That law already exists for dogs, and this pending legislation would expand that application to ensure it covers other domestic animals, other owned animals, such as farm animals. And so that will help address things like, the animals you see standing in mud. So it may not rise to the level of felony cruelty, but it definitely needs addressing. And so there are opportunities to raise those minimum standards in other ways.
Yes, great. And so, I mean, there's some people who say, well, you're passing these measures in some states that actually don't have a lot of that domestic production happening or whatever. But I think these things add up and they add up and add up. And next thing you turn around and you've got a significant number of states that ban these production methods. And I think there's a sort of hope that one day, once you have enough of these, that might be enough momentum to try and get a national standard set, and that, the producers themselves might see some value in that, because then it's a consistent standard. I know, Josh, the Humane Society of the United States had negotiated pretty well with the United Egg Producers to do just that, to actually set a national standard for the confinement of egg-laying hens. And it was actually the pork producers that came in and killed that bill. Can you talk a little bit about how you directly yourself have worked with egg producers in certain states to try and get them on board with getting some of these confinement bills passed?
What I've learned is that in the egg industry, especially, starting in this movement, I used to be an undercover investigator. I used to work in slaughterhouses. I did open rescues and factory farms. There was just a view of opposition, like these people are just pure monsters, just the devils incarnate. In reality, a lot of folks are pretty reasonable when you have a conversation. And, if I was perhaps, my dad ran an egg company, maybe I'd be running an egg company right now. And just having different perspectives allows folks from different, maybe moral views, to actually come together to actually have conversations. And so when we went to those states after Prop 12 to ban the production and the sale of eggs from caged chickens, I had to talk to somebody. And the folks who I talked to were egg producers. And sure, they weren't necessarily thrilled with everything that we all collectively are doing, but they were open to finding a path that they thought was better for them and they thought was reasonable to us. And frankly, I agreed. And once we actually had those dialogues, and I could actually understand concerns that they had that we could overcome, similar to when Brian talked about concerns that he was able to overcome with the Farm Bureau, we could adapt how we pass the law, adapt some language within the law that would settle concerns enough for them to say, you know what, not thrilled necessarily what's going on here, but we can live with this and we can find a path forward doing a different production system. If we all were together 10 years ago, and we looked at the percentage of egg-laying hens who are cage-free in the United States, it would be single digits. Now, it's more than 40%. That's more than 100 million egg-laying hens annually who are cage-free. And if you look at the food corporations who buy the eggs, the McDonald's of the world, the Burger Kings of the world, the Costco's of the world, during that 10-year frame, many of them have switched to either 100% cage-free on their eggs, or at least they're on the path to get there. And all of this momentum is showing that our strategy is working. And of course, we had to start somewhere. Of course, we had to start with Florida on gestation crates. Of course, we had to give hens more space in California in 2008 in Prop 2. But as long as we keep moving things forward, that's how progress happens. And you know what? You don't have to trust Brian or Steph or myself or Chris or Kim. Look what agribusiness says, who despises everything that we stand for. They're trying right now to pass the EATS Act in Congress. That's EATS, EATS Act, that wipe out these laws that we talked about. Now, why do they want to wipe out these laws? If they weren't impactful, they wouldn't care. But they themselves, agribusiness themselves, say, wait a second, this has shifted our industry and we don't like it. And we want to stop this from happening again. And we want to wipe out the things that already occurred. Trust what their opposition is doing. And fortunately, we have a big coalition fighting the EATS Act, and hopefully we will prevail and these laws will remain and future laws will occur. At the same time, I think that it is critical to remember something that Brian said and Steph mentioned and Chris epitomizes, which is so much of this work is because we all are in this together. And I think especially on the farm animal side within the animal protection field, we look to ourselves as friends. I don't look at Brian or Steph or Chris or Kim. It's like, this is Kim Kelly at Animal Legal Defense Fund. No, this is Kim, my friend, working together. You know, these are people who care, that work together. We remove egos, we remove credit. We just want to win for animals. And I think the success we've had with the farm animal field shows that when that happens, we can bring about very special things for farm animals.
That's really wonderful, and I couldn't agree more, Josh. Our time is coming to a close. Brian and Steph, do you each want to just take 1 minute to sort of share some of your biggest lessons or takeaways from your experience working on these issues? Steph, you can go first.
Sure. I think my biggest takeaway is the relationships that you need to have with elected officials, with coalition partners, with your opponents, that those are so important to making progress and to making your life easier in the process of pursuing that progress.
Yeah, I second what Josh just said, and I agree with that. Relationships and communication are key. I would just finally add, you know, I do this for myself, and I would encourage everybody working in this to do it. As you know, this is a roller coaster of advocacy. There are ups, there are downs. And you know, sometimes it's easy to get discouraged or overly cynical, but keeping in mind the type of progress that's been made during those lows on the roller coaster, and really putting things into context about, you know, we're fighting the good fight, we're fighting the right fight. The wind is at our backs. There's been such tremendous progress. Everything we do that's positive and productive in this fight is building it's building the inertia. It's building the momentum. And so no matter what comes at us, no matter how long something takes or how difficult it can get, there's been clear examples on this webinar of just times we were down and being kicked, we got right back up and we changed and we fought and we got it done and we won. So I just encourage everybody to be encouraged by, you know, what you've all heard today, and that progress is achievable, and we've all done it. So I'm inspired all the time by everybody that is in this movement and the work that's been achieved. And I look forward to continuing to work with everybody. So thank you.
Again, I couldn't agree more. And I want to thank you each as panelists, and thank you each as friends for the work that we've all done together on this, and, you know, knowing each other for the many, many years that we have.